היו חלשות ולא היו נראות טוב, הם לקחו אותם, לא המשיכו.
לא חזרו.
After the war, I had a sort of hope that maybe she was in some displaced persons camp.
Throughout the Second World War, the process of isolating, rounding up, transporting, and killing Jews depended on the collaboration of local populations. But amidst all this chaos, there was one young lady who vowed to protect Jews and stand for justice, and her story inspired millions. Born in Strasbourg, Alsace in 1882, Elisabeth Abegg was one of the few women to acquire a postdoctoral degree at the time. After completing her studies in history and ancient languages, she taught at various secondary schools and was an outspoken advocate of women's rights. She was a staunch champion of democracy who detested the Germans, worrying more and more about her students' fate. She had to stand by and watch Jewish students and colleagues expelled from her school. When her good friend, a Jewish woman, was deported, she vowed that she would help the Jews. That was her motive. In the late 1930s, she was denounced during one of her classes by a group of fanatical Germans among her students. When she declared that English soldiers had been as brave as German soldiers, she was forced into early retirement. What gave her some room for maneuver were her good contacts with trustworthy and reliable colleagues from her time as a teacher. She built up a strong network of helpers for Jews who had been forced underground. She even adopted a Jewish girl who survived by hiding at her place. Elisabeth Abegg saved around 80 people, but we only know 30 of them by name. Siblings Ralph and Rita Nyman were among those who were saved. They went underground in Berlin in February 1943 and were finally placed with the Wendland family by members of the local congregation, who belonged to Elisabeth Abegg's network. Those in hiding had to move from one place to the next, fairly often to avoid detection. Elisabeth Abegg not only provided shelter, she also taught classes for young Jews in the underground once a week. I owe it to Elisabeth Abegg that I didn't end up stupid, Ralph Nyman later recalled in his memoir. In the terrible environment of controlled Berlin, the Nyman family became stuck in a nightmare that appeared to worsen by the day. As Jews, they were subjected to the Third Reich continual tightening of the noose that had been placed around them. Their rights were taken away, their livelihoods decimated, and their lives were progressively jeopardized. The once lively city that had been their home had become a dangerous atmosphere, with danger lurking around every corner. The Nymans had heard about Elisabeth Abegg, a brave history teacher who had quietly but bravely become a light of hope for Jews in Berlin. They turned to her for help because they were desperate and had no other options. But getting help was no easy task. It meant risking everything. Anyone could betray them, and merely a whisper to the wrong person could result in their capture and execution. Elisabeth realized the gravity of their position instantly. She understood that harboring the Nymans was an act of defiance against the dictatorship, one that could cost her life. Nevertheless, she never hesitated. Elisabeth welcomed the family into her home with a calm and steady resolve, her demeanor expressing both her enormous courage and compassion. For the Nymans, Elisabeth's flat was a haven, but it was also a place of anxiety and worry. Every squeak in the floorboards, every knock on the door, may mean doom. Elisabeth worked feverishly to prepare the family's escape from the city. She realized they needed more than just a location to hide. They needed a means out of the country, a path to freedom that was becoming increasingly difficult to find. Elisabeth's network of relationships became critical. She contacted trustworthy friends, past students, and even members of the Quaker community, all of whom shared her ideals and were eager to help, despite the great risks. They worked together to counterfeit documents, create false identities, and plan a route for the Nymans to escape Berlin and find safety. The journey was risky. The family had to go through checkpoints, avoid German patrols, and rely on the compassion of people who were also living in perpetual fear. Elisabeth's rigorous planning was put to the test at every stage. There were times when it appeared that the plan might fail, when a misplaced document or a suspicious look from a guard could have ended everything. Throughout it all, Elisabeth remained a constant presence, providing confidence and advice. The Nymans, with only a few personal things and an intense sensation of anxiety, clung to the hope that Elisabeth had given them. That optimism was all they had left. Finally, after days of stressful travel, they crossed the border into Switzerland. a neutral nation where they could finally breathe freely, secure from the terror they had fled. The relief they felt when they arrived in Switzerland was incredible. For the first time in years, they were outside the German reach. It was a moment of tremendous thankfulness, not only for their newfound safety, but also for the remarkable woman who had made it possible. Elisabeth had sacrificed everything for them, including her life, freedom, and future. The Nymans would survive the war, eternally grateful to Elisabeth Abegg, whose bravery had rescued them. Thanks to this bold move, Rita Nyman was issued new papers and food stamps. She could even work legally. Elisabeth Abegg was a religious person, a typically Prussian woman, perfectly able to distinguish between a white lie and blind obedience. To escape, many Berlin's Jews went underground, calling themselves U-boats in self-mocking reference to German submarines. Anna Hirschberg, a Christian of Jewish origin, had been Abegg's close friend for years. Aged over 60, she was sent to Auschwitz, turning down her friend's offer to conceal her. Abegg spent many hours traveling around Berlin by tram and S-Bahn, visiting Jewish children concealed in secret locations, bringing food, money, and forged papers. Concerned that Jewish children were missing out on education because they were in hiding, she started to tutor some in her home. She helped a Jewish teacher, Elisabeth Abegg, and her young foster daughter Suzanne, who had to move frequently, hiding in several different flats under assumed names. Abegg and her circle also concealed a young Jewish leader, Yitzchak Schwersens. Yitzchak Schwersens was a young man who was passionate about education and deeply committed to his community. Prior to the establishment of the dictatorship, he organized youth activities and rose to the position of Jewish community leader. His leadership abilities and capacity to instill optimism in others made him a target for the Germans, who intended to eliminate any kind of resistance or leadership among the Jewish people. By the time Elisabeth Abegg met him, Schwersens was a wanted man, continuously on the run from the Gestapo. The guy was no ordinary fugitive. He was a significant player in the Jewish resistance movement, whose detection would not only result in his passed away, but also jeopardize anybody affiliated with him. However, for Elisabeth, the option was obvious. Her moral compass, inspired by her deep faith and unwavering sense of justice, would not let her turn him down. Schwersens appeared at Elisabeth's door, exhausted and desperate. The continual worry of capture had worn him down, yet he stayed steadfast in his resolve to continue his work. This wasn't a simple task. Schwersens had a recognizable face and a reputation that preceded him, making the task of concealing him much more dangerous. Nonetheless, with meticulous planning and utmost discretion, Elisabeth was able to keep him hidden from the German regime's ever-watchful gaze. Elisabeth's flat was turned into a clandestine headquarters. Schwersens could relax, plan, and carry on his task, although in the shadows. The stress in the flat was tangible, as every knock on the door and sound from the street below could signal the end. Yet, despite the terror, there was a sense of purpose. Schwersens was not simply hiding. He was carrying out his task, coordinating with other members of the resistance and keeping the torch of defiance against the German burning. One of the most terrifying events during Schwersens's concealment was when the Gestapo raided the neighborhood. The sound of boots on the stairs, harsh raps on doors, and shouts of instructions filled the air, unleashing a wave of panic throughout the building. Elisabeth, calm but attentive, moved quickly to conceal Schwersens in a hidden compartment they had set up for such eventualities. The compartment was small, barely large enough for him to fit, but it was their only choice. Elisabeth's heart raced as the Gestapo officers searched the building. She understood that any expression of concern, any hint that something was wrong, would bring them straight to Schwersens. She braced herself and maintained a calm demeanor as the officers raided her flat. Minutes felt like hours as they explored every nook, turned over furniture, and looked for signs of resistance activity. However, fate was on their side that day. After discovering nothing untoward, the officers left. As the sound of their footsteps receded down the stairs, Elisabeth let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Schwersens emerged from his hiding location, frightened but unharmed. It was a close call, a reminder of the fine edge they tread every day. Despite the dread of the moment, there was a newfound sense of determination. They had survived, and as long as they did, they would keep fighting. Every Friday, Jewish fugitives came to lunch at Abegg's flat. For 2 hours we could forget we could no longer live like human beings, one recalled. Abegg offered fugitives safety, protection, and food, but also kindness, reassurance, and goodness. Abegg and her friends helped an estimated 80 people with lodging, food, money, clothing, and forged documents. Most survived. Miraculously, Abegg's activities were never discovered. After the war, white-haired and angelic, she returned to teaching. In 1957, for her 75th birthday, survivors dedicated a collection of memoirs to her. They included the following tribute. With Dr. Abegg was revealed the truth that a life of love for one's fellow human beings, together with respect for others, is the most elevated and eternal value. Through their Christian faith, conviction, and humanity, the people who stood by us were strong enough to face fear when their neighbors were driven off on trucks and their belongings dragged away. The vast majority of those living under German control were either complicit or turned a blind eye to what was happening. Yet a few, at great risk to their own lives, did all they could to save Jews from capture. Most teachers at the time were loyal to the party line, but Elisabeth Abegg was a courageous woman, making a deliberate decision to help those in need. Her actions make her stand out from most of her former colleagues. For Ruth and Inge Dublon, life under the German government was a never-ending sequence of escapes, each more perilous than the last. As Jewish sisters in Berlin, they had been on the run, continuously shifting from one hiding location to the next. Their lives had become a blur of darkened rooms, whispered discussions, and the constant fear of discovery. The sisters had lost everything, including their home, family, and sense of security. They were young, scared, and alone in a city that had turned on them. The Dublons had heard whispered rumors about Elisabeth Abegg, a woman who defied the Germans by providing shelter to those in need. For Ruth and Inge, this was their final chance. When they arrived at Elisabeth's flat, they were both physically and emotionally exhausted. The fear they felt was almost intolerable, and it was carved into their faces, gestures, and shaking voices. Elisabeth greeted them with warmth that was both surprising and immensely pleasant. The sisters felt safe for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. Elisabeth's flat became their home, a little but significant beacon of light among the immense sea of darkness that had engulfed their life. Despite the relative protection of Elisabeth's walls, the fear persisted. Every day was a gamble, a never-ending fight to maintain the appearance of normalcy in a crazy world. The sisters were fully aware of the danger they were in, both for themselves and for Elisabeth. Elisabeth understood that hiding the Dublons was only a temporary solution. The Germans were relentless, and the city was teeming with informants and accomplices looking to earn favor with the leadership. Elisabeth began working on a more permanent solution for the sisters. She contacted her network again, this time looking for anyone who could assist them in leaving the country. Meanwhile, Elisabeth did everything she could to re-establish normalcy in the sisters' lives. She engaged them in discussions on literature and history, topics that had previously been part of their daily lives, but had been eclipsed by the horrors of war. These moments of normalcy were more than just a distraction. They served as a reminder of the life they had been forced to leave behind, as well as a monument to Elisabeth's belief in the significance of being hopeful, even in the darkest of times. One very moving moment occurred when Elisabeth discovered a method to get a few books for the sisters. Inge, the younger of the two, had always enjoyed reading, and seeing a familiar book brought tears to her eyes. It was a little gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything to her. It served as a reminder of her humanity, the life she previously had, and the potential of a post-war future. Ruth and Inge were finally ready to depart after weeks of hiding. Elisabeth had located a new hiding location for them, away from the German regime's prying eyes. The departure was bittersweet. The sisters had grown close to Elisabeth, who had not only saved their lives but also given them hope and motivation to keep going. As they prepared to leave, Elisabeth embraced them and spoke words of comfort and encouragement. She promised that they would see the battle through, that they would survive, and that they would be able to tell their story. Ruth and Inge clung to these words as they left Elisabeth's flat, returning to the terrifying unknown. The sisters' quest was far from complete, but Elisabeth's courage and kindness had given them the strength to persevere. They would survive the battle, remembering the woman who risked everything to save them. They hid Jewish refugees to protect them from deportation. Together with former students, friends, and their sister, they provided the persecuted with food and false papers. Elisabeth Abegg managed to save 80 people with her network. The Berlin teacher is one of an estimated tens of thousands of people who helped Jewish refugees in the Third Reich. Around 5,000 people in hiding survived thanks to the courageous efforts of these helpers. For almost half a century, the helpers and their actions were ignored. Firstly, the Germans, as the perpetrators and instigators of the genocide, had absolutely no interest in being confronted with an alternative course of action. In other words, it was not only possible to watch the deportation, but also to help someone who was being persecuted. Secondly, all forms of resistance against the Germans in the post-war period, including helping those who were being persecuted, were still seen as betrayal of Germany, and those who resisted were seen as traitors. This also applied to those who saw and used opportunities in the Wehrmacht to help Jews or prisoners of war. The first person the German public heard about was a sergeant called Anton Schmidt, who came from Vienna and who had saved the lives of hundreds of Jews, at least temporarily, in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. This became known because a Jewish partisan leader from Vilnius told the audience at the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem that there were such people among the Germans, and one of those surprised was Hannah Arendt, who wrote this down in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, and thus communicated it to a certain small intellectual public. Overall, up until 50 years after the end of the Second World War, there was no interest in helpers and rescuers. And not only that, there was a downright defensive attitude. People did not want to acknowledge that such people existed. In the Wehrmacht, resistance was the last thing one expected. For a long time, the claim persisted that people who refused to take part in the shooting of Jews had to fear for their own lives, a defensive claim, as we now know. The result, not a single person could be found who was shot for not taking part in the shootings themselves. Instead, the sanctions were much less severe. Loss of reputation among one's own troops, a warning. But the Wehrmacht members did not know that when they mustered the courage to defy such execution orders, or to help Jews and prisoners of war in other ways. At the front and in the countries occupied by the German Wehrmacht, there was complete uncertainty about what would happen to soldiers who rescued Jews. This was different from the situation for civilians in the German Reich. Here, the criminal offense of aiding and abetting Jews existed. Here, helpers who were discovered risked being sent to a concentration camp. One of the most famous Jewish rescuers today, Oskar Schindler, was only honored after he passed away. The 1993 film Schindler's List brought his action to rescue Jews to the general public. This film marked a turning point in the landscape of remembrance and has since significantly expanded knowledge about helpers during the Third Reich. Around 3,800 people are known by name today. It has emerged that the helpers came from all walks of life, with very different political and religious views. Both in the country and in the big city, they recognized and used their scope for action. In Berlin, there were prostitutes hiding people at Alexanderplatz. That's because they were always used to operating in a certain gray area, and different conditions were in place. Otto Veit, one of the most important rescuers of Jews in Berlin, worked closely with the prostitute Hedwig Porschitz. Inge Deutschkron was saved when Hedwig Porschitz gave her a workbook from another Berlin prostitute. That eventually came to light when the prostitute was found in Hungary. But we always have the opportunity to redefine the scope of action for those people who are willing to help, who are willing to participate. The rescuers came from all walks of life. Some were wealthy, some were not. However, there were many more poor heroes than rich ones. Marie Bird was a rag-and-bone woman, poor as a church mouse. She had no children and lived in a small apartment in the basement of a tenement house in the Wedding district of Berlin, eking out a living by selling newspapers. Despite her own destitution, she helped 3 young men, the Joseph brothers and a friend of theirs, to survive the Third Reich. One day they knocked on her door and asked for help. Marie Bird was a very strange woman. Nothing in her entire apartment came from animals, no blankets filled with down, no meat of any kind. She lived a strictly vegan life and slept on piles of paper. She had a good heart, and what little she possessed, she shared generously with others. Marie Bird had a small garden outside Berlin. where the three men built a makeshift bomb shelter and hid. In order to provide for all of them, Marie sold her ration stamps for cigarettes and meat. Even after the war, they did not lose touch. When Germany was partitioned, Marie stayed in the Soviet sector. Many of those who survived emigrated after the war. The Joseph brothers, however, stayed in West Berlin. They visited their savior whenever they could, supporting her to the best of their abilities. Once a Jew was apprehended, his or her fate was sealed. They fell into the hands of the German secret state police, and from 1942 onwards, they lost the right to a trial in a regular court, which meant they were at the mercy of those who hunted them down. The sentences they faced ranged from imprisonment to loss of life. The fate of those who had been helping them was uncertain too. They could be tried, but had to be charged with a criminal offense. Hiding Jews was not a crime on the statutes, so the prosecutors invented other offenses so that these people could be found guilty and punished anyway. These ranged from tuning in to enemy radio stations or falsifying documents to violating economic wartime regulations, such as trading rationed foodstuffs on the black market. But if you had taken in people who'd gone underground, there was no way you could avoid violating those regulations about rations and food. Most defendants were sentenced to prison terms, sometimes under harsh conditions involving hard manual labor. Some were found guilty of high treason for drafting or distributing leaflets. Those who denied it all could usually not be proven guilty before a regular court, so they were sent to concentration camps without due process. Some survived, others did not. In Berlin, they were sent to the notorious prison in Grosse Hamburger Strasse, which had earlier served as a central camp for rounded-up Jews who were to be deported. In early 1945, a savior named Agnes Wendland was an inmate there for 4 weeks. Helene Jacobs, a Protestant Christian woman active in the underground, was also caught. She had been helping Jewish passport forger Tioma Schönhaus and was a committed member of the well-networked Confessing Church, which was opposed to the Third Reich. She was upset by the fate of the Jews, all the more so after working as a secretary for a Jewish lawyer in the 1930s. On January 11, 1944, she was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment with hard labor by a special tribunal in Berlin and eventually released in 1945. Other rescuers suffered the same fate, surviving despite the dreadful conditions in the correctional facilities. As the situation worsened for the Jews, Elisabeth contacted former students who were Jewish and invited them to gather in her home. Once a week, on Friday afternoons, she prepared a hot meal for these students and their friends. Regardless of the risks, the group met every week, and her apartment became a haven of warmth and a place where this group of friends planned life-saving strategies for each other. As it became too dangerous for Jews to be on the streets of Berlin, Abegg began to make trips out of the city in search of hiding places. When money was needed for transportation and bribes to get Jews across the border into neutral Switzerland, she sold her own jewelry in order to finance the escapes. She was able to continue her activities until the end of the war. Many years later, for Elisabeth Abegg's 75th birthday, the people she had rescued, who were by then living all over the world, gathered in Berlin. They presented her with a book of memoirs that they had compiled called A Light That Shines in the Darkness, and celebrated her birthday with her. Elisabeth Abegg was awarded the title Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem in 1967. Elisabeth Abegg showed compassion for persecuted Jews. Why did these people put themselves at risk to help others? Most of them had no answer to this question. For many of them, helping was the natural course of action to take, explaining that they simply did what they thought needed to be done. It was their attitude toward the Third Reich. They rejected the racial ideology and didn't close their eyes while so many others did. The saviors were both politically and humanitarianly aware. They were brave enough to question the ideology and act on their beliefs, which put them at considerable risk.